Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into and unpack a highly provocative and totally unconventional theory from our source material. We're looking at a text that aims to completely rewrite the established consensus on human history by presenting a framework centered on the American origin of Neanderthals. It's a bold, sweeping claim, and it goes right up against mainstream historical models. So we're going to walk step by step through the exact sequence of arguments and examine the specific genetic evidence the source relies on to make this fascinating case. Let's get right into it.
So, let's start with a really fundamental question about our ancient ancestors to test the geographical logic presented right at the beginning of the text. Where do Neanderthals actually come from? For decades, the traditional narrative has pointed us in one very specific, widely accepted direction. But our source asks us to pause for a second, zooming in on a glaring geographical anomaly that basically challenges everything we previously thought we knew about early hominid migration patterns.
Well, the source points out a massive historical dilemma right out of the gate. If Sub-Saharan Africa truly delivered all human ancestors, which is what's commonly taught in standard anthropological models, the text argues that we should logically find ample physical evidence of Neanderthals in that region. But here's the kicker. We do not. They are entirely absent from that specific sub-Saharan fossil record. The source uses this complete physical absence as the foundational crack in the current geographical consensus, basically demanding that we look elsewhere for the true starting line.
All right, moving into Section 1, Unpacking Haplotype B006.
So what exactly is haplotype B006? The text identifies this specific genetic marker as the definitive ancestral marker for tracking Neanderthals. Think of it like a biological breadcrumb trail embedded deep within the human genome. If the physical bone fragments aren't where conventional wisdom expects them to be, the source argues that the ancient genetic code will ultimately reveal the true geographical origin. To fully grasp this radical new map of human history, we literally have to follow B0006 because it's the absolute key to unlocking the entire theory presented in the material.
What makes this marker absolutely fascinating is its specific geographical distribution. The text states that the very first whole genome haplotype group splitting for B006, meaning the exact evolutionary moment this Neanderthal lineage branches off from modern humans, happens dominantly in the Americas. And conversely, it happens least in Africa. The source uses this stark genetic contrast to essentially flip the traditional evolutionary map totally upside down, using raw genetic branching data to point away from the old world and directly toward the new one.
To get really specific about where this marker currently resides, the text argues that these peak frequencies aren't just floating around in a geographical vacuum. They're located explicitly within the ancient and modern DNA of several Native American groups. By tethering the Neanderthal lineage directly to the indigenous populations of the Americas, the source bridges a massive geographical divide using hard genetic data. The implication here is just enormous, suggesting an unbroken biological link connecting our ancient hominid past to modern, living populations in the Western Hemisphere.
Which brings us to Section 2, the American origin theory. According to the framework established by the source, this genetic evidence demands a total rewrite of the historical map. The resulting claim is totally uncompromising. Neanderthals are definitively not European, and they are not Western Eurasian either. Because of the sheer dominance and branching origins of haplotype B0006 in the Americas, the data leads them to forcefully conclude that Neanderthals hold a strictly American origin. This entirely bypasses the traditional evolutionary pathways taught in mainstream science.
So instead of that standard Eurasian narrative we're also used to hearing, the text reframes Neanderthals as a vital, foundational part of American indigenous history. It actually goes so far as to vividly label Neanderthals an export product of the Americas. That's an incredibly compelling use of terminology, right? It paints a picture of the ancient Americas not as a final, distant destination for wandering hominids, but rather as the primary manufacturing hub, the absolute geographic and genetic point of origin for this species.
Okay, let's look at Section 3, Deployed by Modern Humans. Now you're probably wondering, how on earth did they get across the globe? The text takes this concept a massive step further, stating there is clear evidence that they have been deployed in their assumed range by modern humans. Notice that word deployed. It is highly specific and undeniably intentional here. The source is actually suggesting that modern humans actively moved, distributed, or managed Neanderthal populations, physically bringing them into the Eurasian regions where we typically excavate their remains today. This perspective completely shifts the dynamic from a natural independent migration of a wandering species into a managed relocation overseen by the modern humans.
Let's wrap this up with Section 4, Challenging the Consensus.
Let's quickly summarize the distinct logical sequence the source constructs to build this massive, paradigm-shifting case. First, it points to the missing African evidence, that notable lack of Neanderthal fossils in Sub-Saharan Africa. Second, it identifies the Native American genetic link, using haplotype B006 as the biological anchor. Third, it establishes the radical American origin theory based strictly on that DNA dominance. And finally, it argues for the deliberate deployment of Neanderthals into Eurasia by modern humans. It's a tightly woven, continuous narrative derived directly from their interpretation of these specific genetic data points.
And, the source explicitly acknowledges the immense friction this entire theory creates. It frankly notes that these findings are, quote, hard to swallow and extremely inconvenient for consensus. It is a direct admission that because the broadly accepted scientific community relies so heavily on the traditional out-of-Africa framework, this new genetic interpretation is deeply disruptive. Accepting this timeline means upending established historical norms, textbook geography, and honestly, everything we assume about the fundamental directions of ancient global migration.
Which leaves us with a final, totally fascinating question to ponder regarding the sheer fragility of established historical paradigms. If a single genetic marker like haplotype B006 truly possesses the potential to completely rewrite the map of human origins, shifting the spotlight from Africa and Eurasia directly over to the Americas, what other accepted scientific truths might be waiting to be overturned by the very next major genetic discovery? It definitely proves that the sweeping story of our ancient past is far from settled and is actually still actively being written in our DNA. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this deep dive gave you a lot to think about.